Hey everyone, welcome back to another devlog. I got a pretty exciting one this time with a lot of stuff to show off, so we're going to get right into it. Start off, we're going to talk about the combat. It's been changed quite a bit, and I think you guys are going to love this new iteration of it. So instead of the old combat system that has about 3 directions that you can attack in, I've changed it up to use this system that I've been calling Omnidirectional. It allows you to attack and block in any direction, and instead of using hard-coded left, right, or up kind of attacks, we use math instead. So as you can see, as I drag my mouse across the screen here, there's this line that gets drawn from the middle to my mouse location. This is indicating the direction you're planning to attack. So as soon as I finish swiping my mouse here, you can see the attack animation that gets chosen is based on the direction that I swiped my mouse. Not only does this allow you to attack in any direction you want to, but it just makes you feel so much more in control of your character. It really adds this immersive layer onto combat that makes you feel like you're in control of how your character is reacting in combat. As for blocking, it's actually pretty cool. Now you don't have to be perfect with your block every time just to be able to block any damage. It actually uses a dot product on the angle between the attack direction and your block direction. This means anything up to a 90-degree angle of the attack direction will block some bit of damage. The closer you get to their attack direction, the more damage you will block. This is also influenced by your shield's blocking stat and your character's block rating, as well as your attacker's weapon and so on, but more on that later. I also have a system in play for perfect blocks. That's when your block direction almost perfectly matches the attack direction. When this occurs, it'll stun the attacker, allowing for you to retaliate with your own combo of attacks. And of course there's still dodging and kicking and other things you can use in combat, but these were the 2 biggest changes I've made since the last update. While we're on combat, let's talk about how damage works. This is a fun one, so you might want to buckle in. In Sovereign, there's 9 different types of damage: slashing, piercing, bludgeoning, fire, cold, lightning, poison, necrotic, and radiant damage. Different armors can have resistances in all of these types of damage. The armor's resistance value is between 0 and 100, which then gets translated into a percentage later on. To make this easy, let's just say we have a sword that does 10 slashing damage. If we hit an enemy who has an armor with a slashing resistance of 50, we would only do 5 damage because it's 50% of our sword's damage. Now the sword's damage value isn't the only thing that influences the end result. Every weapon has both its damage and its critical chance and multiplier rating. Plus, they all have their own random rolled characteristics. These characteristics are just minor changes in your weapon that can make the same weapon vastly different every single time you find one. So as you can see here, this hammer has the characteristic hard-hitting, hollow, and well-crafted, which slightly changes its final damage output. So well-crafted gives a 10% increase to all physical damage, and hollow here does a 10% increase to speed, but also a 10% decrease to all physical damage, so these kind of cancel each other out in a way. And then hard-hitting is a 10% decrease to weapon critical chance, but a 15% increase to weapon critical multiplier. If we take a look at this sword over here, you can see it's both serrated and flimsy. These characteristics are randomly applied when the weapon is created and will influence the base damage and other stats of the weapon. Other than your weapon, there's multiple other layers that can influence your character's damage. Any perks you choose inside the skill tree could influence damage, as well as enchanted items they could own or any buffs or debuffs the character might have. Anything that can influence your character's base damage is set up as a layer, so I can always add more of these on later on if I wanted to. All of this together is really only calculated when things change, and it's pre-baked into a single float value that's then used every time you hit a character to then calculate damage. This way we're not running the calculation of how much damage you should be doing every single time you hit somebody. This system is set up the exact same when it comes to resistances for the character too. You have both your items, their characteristics, enchantments, debuffs, and everything else. But all this comes down to is basically your damage subtracted by the character's resistance percentage. But now you might be asking, what happens if we block a hit? How much damage do we do then? Well, your block rating is set up the same way your damage and resistance is set up. It has the characteristics and enchantments and all that play into it. But in the end, what it comes down to is your final block rating. We multiply that by the dot product of how close you were to the attack direction when they hit you, and then we subtract that from the amount of damage you would have taken. So with a sword of 10 damage, when it hits you, if you had a shield with a block rating of 10, then you could block all the damage if it was a perfect block. Anything less than, and you would start to take a percentage damage of how close you were to that attack direction, before any resistances are applied. There is one exception to this rule. A perfect block, no matter what your block rating is and the amount of damage you would take, it will always block 100% of the damage. This is because I wanted to reward the player when they were doing really well in combat. So yeah, that's basically the damage and combat system in a nutshell since I've last updated you guys. And that is a small fraction of everything that's changed since the last time, so let's get into the next thing. So this next one I'm going to kind of gloss over real quick because it gets extremely technical really fast. So basically our really cool armor system with like overlaying armors on top of each other with all of their slots and stuff just became extremely performant. We're using skeletal mesh merging to merge all of your slots together into one skeletal mesh, and then that's what we're using for the actual character. This all happens at runtime and is fully replicated, so it allows for us to render way less skeletal meshes than we were before. But that's not just it, because the character would still have quite a bit of draw calls, because for every armor slot they had was a separate material, and for every material is a single draw call. So thanks to an idea that was first brought to my attention by Prismatic Dev, we also merged the material slots down into one and create one master material with all of the armor slots textures in there. This essentially takes every single character down to one single draw call on screen, no matter how much armor they have equipped. Now the really fancy part here is, because of all the UVs overlapping each other, which would kind of create a giant mess with all the textures and everything, I was able to find a way to change UVs at runtime. I know that sounds weird, and if you don't know what a UV is, it's basically how a texture gets applied to a 3D mesh. So when a character equips an armor, it'll move that armor's UV to a new subdivision of the final UV, and then basically do the same thing for the texture so that they can match up and not overlap with all the other armor's UV maps. It's actually a really, really cool system I'm super excited about, and the reason it's really important is it allows me to make armors the same way I've always been and not have to change my work style at all. I don't have to make armors with the notion in mind that I'll have to move their UVs to a specific quadrant of a UV just so it matches whatever other armor the player could end up equipping. This whole fancy solution just does it automatically for me. Now there's a whole lot of other new systems I've created for the game, and this video would be way too long if I went over all of them, so here's basically the high points. There's the basics for random loot generation, which still need a little bit more work later on to take into account the player's level and how many players are in a game at once. There's also the ability to loot AI once they've been killed, so you can take their weapons and armors from them and any other things they might have in their inventory. There's also the basics of AI spawning, so now we can spawn in and out AI based on where the character's location is. That way there's not always just a bunch of persistent AI on screen. This takes into account how close the player is before it wants to spawn, and then once it actually triggers, it makes sure that AI will always spawn in a place that's off the player's screen, whether it's behind a building or wall or even behind the player. This is to avoid the player ever seeing the AI actually just pop up in front of them, as that's pretty easily going to break immersion. This also still kind of needs some work so it can scale based on the amount of players there are in the game, whether we're going to just add more AI or up their difficulty or however I decide to do it. Next was the character's appearance and the replication of that. And I'm not talking about like armors and everything, because that was already done. This is like your hairstyle and color and race and height and all of those extra like character creator kind of values. Now that that's all done and has been fully replicated, basically the foundation for a character creator system is already sitting there waiting to be made. Everything boils down to a data asset. So all I really got to do is make this UI so you can edit this data asset, and that's basically the character creator. So that bit can be created at any time and will probably be coming pretty soon. Also, the system works exactly the same for the AI, so I can create these data assets in Editor and assign them to the AI, and that's their appearance in game. That's how I'll get to decide who is who. Like, you walk into the same town, you'd want to see the same blacksmith and the same traders and stuff like that. But what's also cool is I also made a system so these data assets can be fully randomized, allowing me to create randomly generated NPCs throughout the world. And that's obviously because I don't want to handcraft every single person you see in the world. When you come up across a group of like 10 bandits, I don't need to go through and create every single 10 bandit and what they look like and what their name is and all that stuff. Next, there's new weapon types and combat styles. The new weapon types include like maces, spears, hammers, and axes. And with those, the new combat styles are just the spears, and then hammers and axes kind of use the same one. So the spear animations ended up being kind of a pain because we didn't have enough of them, and I had to go through and make my own animations for it. But after all that, we finally ended up getting enough animations to fill out the entire combat style. And luckily, hammers and axes ended up using the same animations as the big two-handed swords with some little bits of tweaks. I basically just had to use some IK work to decide how they're going to hold the hammers and axes different, because holding it from the end like you would a sword made it look really, really weird. So I just went through all the animations and decided where their hand placement should be, so it looks like it's a lot more of a heavier object that they have to hold and swing. Personally, I think it came out extremely well and ended up being one of my favorite combat styles in the game so far. Alright, other than that, there's been a lot more tweaks to the AI with combat and how they approach what they're doing at certain times in combat to make it more fun and understandable for the player. Oh, and I also taught the AI how to use bows. That was an interesting journey because of the crazy amount of math it took for them to just work. So because when the player shoots an arrow and the arrow kind of has like drop off and everything with time, I didn't want to change the system for AI at all. It would have been easy just to have them cheat and let the AI just shoot straight at you, and I'm sure the majority of players wouldn't even notice, but I didn't really like it. When you know what's going on, it kind of felt awful. So with that being said, the AI needs to know the drop off of the arrow and how much of an angle they need to basically look up when firing the arrow so it would reach the target they're shooting at. This ended up being a ridiculous amount of math with the velocity of the arrow and then gravity and how much that plays into it, and then the angle at which they have to fire. But you know, if you look too far up, then their range would actually be less than it is, because at some point the arrow has like a peak distance and then it starts like not shooting as far basically. And also because arrows aren't like bullets in games where they're kind of just hit scan, they have like a travel time. Now the AI has to calculate where they think you're gonna be based on your velocity, like your direction of movement and stuff like that, so they can fire in front of you, so if you keep moving straight, the arrow would eventually hit you when it actually reaches you. And then you toss on all of like the elevation changes. If the AI's up on a hill and you're down low, and like they wouldn't want to shoot really high up just because they're farther from you, because now they need to aim down more to hit you, and then vice versa. If you were on a hill and they weren't, how they need to shoot up, and it was a lot of math. I'll just kind of leave it at that. But in the end, I figured all that out, especially with some help from like Twitch chat during my live streams and everything, and now AI can just fire at each other from like any distance or elevation. They can be moving, and their target could be moving the other way, and all this other stuff, and they figure it out. It worked really, really well. And lastly, I know the thing that's on everybody's mind. Did we move to UE5 when it went full release? Yes, I did. And it ended up being a much bigger headache than I was anticipating, but got through all the changes with the engine and all the C++ code that just wouldn't compile because things were different, and it took about a day of just, I don't know, writing code that needed to be updated to all the new stuff. But once it was done, we were in UE5, and yeah, Lumen is really, really good looking. I'm loving the way Lumen looks with the game. Specifically the real-time global illumination, it just blows my mind. How light can like bounce off a surface and reflect that color onto other surfaces. It's crazy. It's really cool. Now, Nanite, on the other hand, is something I'm still debating on using. It kind of has this fixed performance cost, which is really cool, but we don't have enough things that could be Nanite in the scene yet. But as the game grows, I think we'll be able to justify that initial performance cost of Nanite as we add more static things to the scene. Like weapons, buildings, the city of Neverfall. When you walk in there, the entire town probably could just be a bunch of Nanite meshes and save performance. But that's all stuff that I'm debating for later. Right now we're just not using Nanite yet, and later on maybe we will. I'd say the most anticipated feature I had for UE5 was world partition, and it's like really cool. It's way better than world composition in many aspects. Like everything's just automatic. I kind of just build a world, and world partition just figures out how it should do all the streaming and stuff. It's kind of cool. But with that being said, my version of world partition, of course, is broken. So when I hit play on the open world, the world kind of just crashes. There's some null pointer error going on somewhere. I don't know. I was told that it's a known bug and there's probably a fix coming for it in the next update for the engine, so I kind of just have to wait. Now, don't get me wrong, I could dive deep into the engine and try to figure out how to fix it myself, but why would I? If there's a fix coming and it's an official update from Epic, I'm just gonna wait for it. And in the meantime, we just kind of have to test the game in test levels, which I do all along anyway, so it's not really a big deal. Oh, and since we're talking about the open world here real quick, I'll show off. I've been doing a lot more level design, and yeah, there's just a lot more done with the world. Right here's that town of Wildebark that you guys have seen probably many times before. It's kind of had to be redone multiple times, like since we went to multiplayer and everything. So here's the final iteration of it. It's like an overgrown like lumber export town, and it's, in my opinion, it's super beautiful. Level design has been like the one big thing I've been really pushing on lately, because honestly the game is like, I don't want to say ready, but like we could build a gameplay loop. It's there, there's just not a world to play in yet. We have the systems like combat and looting and all that, so many of the big systems are there, and there's just not a world yet to play in, so that's been my biggest focus recently. After there's a lot more of the world laid out, I'll go back and start working on other big systems. Like I think the next biggest one I want to work on is the quest system. Specifically like randomly generating quests. I want to do both random generated quests and quests that like I could make and like write a story out and everything, but the first iteration is going to be like randomly generated. That saves me a lot of time to say like, hey, there's a bounty on this guy's head and you can go claim the money for it, or you know, those, every game's got like the delivery missions and stuff, like all those like random generated quests, and then I can start on top of that building all of like the story missions and stuff like that, and I'm really excited for all of that. But yeah, I think that's everything. There's probably a lot I missed since the last devlog, and I guess if I remember it, I'll make sure to include it in the next one. But until then, thank you everybody for sticking by. I know this was kind of a longer one. Special thanks to all of my Patreons. You guys, again, like the best people in the world, support me in my journey to create this game. It's absolutely amazing, and I just can't thank you guys enough. And to everybody else, like everyone subbed on YouTube and Twitch and all that stuff, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it. And I will see you guys in the next devlog.